Bill, thank you for setting out the transition paths and the elements towards transition paths. Really the objective of the whole transition planning that we're talking about today. I've got two very esteemed panelists, discussants, I should rather say, with us. One is Alberto Carrillo Pineda, who is the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has been very active in the discussions around climate change and the impact of climate change. Jurei, who is the program leader for EU Sustainable Finance at E3G, a global NGO, very active in Brussels as well. Thanks both of you for being with us. Really appreciate that. And maybe before we go into the discussion, it would be interesting to get some initial reactions. And maybe, Alberto, I'll pass over to you first. Having listened to Bill and having read the report, it'd be interesting what your first reactions are.
Thank you very much. And yes, it was a very interesting and very well covered presentation from Bill. And of course, reflecting what we believe in the SBTi is a very strong report, the recommendation from the high-level expert group. I think it's very important that we have such a clear and strong message coming from, I would say, such a well-constituted and recognized group. Because the reality is, even though there's a lot of support and I would say momentum behind net zero, as Bill mentioned, the reality is that a lot of the net zero pledges, most of the net zero pledges that have been made over the past few years are not really consistent with the transformation that needs to happen to achieve climate stability. And so we need to have the same message coming from different sources, and I would say to align the incentives for state, non-state actors and state actors to really embrace the transformation that needs to happen, which is well described in the report and of course in the presentation that we just heard from Bill.
Thank you very much indeed. And maybe Jurei, I'll do the same with you, just some initial thoughts on your side.
Thanks very much. And I agree with much of what Alberto just said. And really coming from perhaps more of a policy perspective, as the E3G is a climate think tank, I cannot stress enough how important it is for us to have a clear understanding of the direction of travel for the transition, not just at an entity level, but at the sector and whole of economy levels, given the massive undertaking that the transformation of our economies and societies for climate neutrality and net zero is. So perhaps reflecting briefly, as my work focuses primarily on the EU, in the EU context, I can say that we have entities, we have regional administrations, national governments that are faced with significant questions around what technologies, innovations, and infrastructure are going to be needed for the transition in the coming decades. So really having an understanding that's grounded and that applies through the clarifications and the recommendations provided by the HLEG will bring immense value to actually answer some of these questions and reduce some of the uncertainty that is present right now in efforts to make the transition. So I think this is a really warmly welcome piece of work, and congratulations to the group in issuing these recommendations.
Thank you very much, Jurei. Maybe come back to you, Alberto. One point is kind of how we get to our targets, so the step-by-step approach. How do you view the ambitions of this report? And in general, what do we think, how do you see the transition needs to unfold? What steps need to be taken? And actually, I want to take in the question from Michael Simoni at the same time, because he asks why the focus in the report, Bill, that's maybe also to you afterwards, why the focus in the report first on CO2 emissions and getting those to zero by 2050, and then looking at greenhouse gases only shortly afterwards? Why the sequencing of these two different categories in a different way? And yeah, just to explain that a bit more. But before we come to that, Alberto, how do you see the step-by-step approach? What is seen as a good approach towards transition?
Thanks. Well, I think Bill's presentation had a very important point, which is emissions need to peak as soon as possible and by later than 2025. I think that is, to me, the first key message that we need to keep in mind. And I would say we work with thousands of companies that go through the process of setting climate targets. And the first step, of course, that they need to take is to have a clear understanding of where their impact is, to have a full comprehensive inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. And the reality is, even though we believe it's a robust practice, it's still something. We just conducted a survey, and for instance, most companies just go through their scope 3 inventory for the first time when they go through the process of setting science-based targets. So it's still, I would say, relatively immature practice compared to what we need. And we know there's a lot of issues in terms of getting accurate data from supply chains in particular. But that's the first step, to have a good understanding about where the impact is. Then to translate the net zero ambition into an actual plan, we said recommendations from the group are to have 5-year targets, which we think are very important, because ultimately we need to put emphasis on both the long-term destination, but also the short-term action. And the short-term action is critical to avoid exceeding our carbon budget. The long-term destination is critical to inform investments, especially those that can have long-term impact on the climate. And so we need both. We need long-term investments aligned to net zero and short-term action to phase out emission sources that we have today. It's critical for us to make sure that targets by companies cover all value chain emissions, not only those that are easy to abate. Also critical to make sure that targets set by companies lead to absolute reductions. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of reducing emissions intensity while increasing emissions on an absolute basis. And the third key point is to make sure that emissions are reduced at their source. As we heard, there's risks involved in relying on negative emissions in the longer term, and they have also trade-offs with other social and environmental goals. So we need to make sure that companies focus on eliminating emissions at the source. And so after setting targets, I think the next key point is to have an action plan on how companies will deliver on these targets. And I think the two most important aspects of an action plan are, first, how investment is going to be aligned to the net zero goal, to avoid adding more sources of emissions to the value chain of the company. And the second one is how companies are going to phase out carbon polluting activities from their operations and from their value chains. And of course, once we have an action plan, then we need to implement. And that's why we have all of this, right? To set targets that ultimately lead to implementation. I think something important in terms of implementation, we need to make sure, I would say, as climate community, that implementation is meaningful, that it actually leads to decarbonization, and not just to eliminate emissions from the books of companies. We need to make sure that actions actually lead to decarbonization. And for that, we need strong accountability systems. We have, of course, a growing ecosystem of disclosure and growing in general growth in the accountability ecosystem. And it's very important also to create measures that make sure that implementation of targets lead to real world decarbonization. I think those are the main points that I see. And yes, back to you.
In a way, you've raised more questions for me than answers. Now we'll come back to some of those, Alberto, in a moment. But before I come to you, Jurei, with another question, maybe Bill, do you want to respond to Michael's question about the sequencing, this time not in steps, but kind of in the type of emissions that we should focus on?
Yeah, this is a question from Michael Zimoni. Yeah, it's a very good question. What is the logic behind net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions shortly after? Well, look, the mandate we had from the Secretary General was to be as close to the science as possible. So actually, and I think we all know in this business that in general, CO2 emissions are reduced faster than greenhouse gas emissions, in part because there are non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions that are harder to abate, to mitigate than carbon dioxide in the agricultural sector and maybe some others. But so to be true to that mandate, it's quite clear that from the IPCC pathways and their filtering that I showed you earlier, that CO2 reduces faster and gets to zero faster, gets to zero earlier. So by 2050 is about the benchmark you need to know for net zero CO2 globally. Now, another important element of the high-level expert group is the just transition element. And that means that in most cases, developed countries, richer countries would need to reduce emissions faster, and that almost always, maybe not always, but almost always means that they would need to get to net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions faster than bigger, poorer developing countries. So that's also an important factor to take into account. And I know the Commission's modelling in the European Union context definitely takes all that into account. But I just wanted to emphasise also that we did also refer to methane. And I think everyone in the business knows methane is very important. It's the source of about 0.5 degree of warming since pre-industrial times. We know if we can reduce methane emissions quickly, that we will cut a peak off the warming. Very important. And we know about the global methane pledge for 30% reduction by 2030. Now, we did point out in the high-level expert group that the methane emission reductions from the energy sector need to be substantially higher, about 64% by 2030, in order for that sector to be aligned with the Paris Agreement type pathways that I showed data from earlier. So we didn't just focus on total greenhouse gas emissions, we really emphasized the significance and importance of methane as well.
I'm happy you raised methane. I would have come to that otherwise. Jurei, I think looking at this, I think so. We have the steps of, we've outlined that, but how do we come to credible projections? How do we come to establishing that what we kind of promise and pledge is credible at the moment of us making those commitments? And how do we project this? How do we measure this?
So I think a key part in all of this, and Alberto and Bill have both spoken to setting out credible targets, is really focusing on the planning aspect. So what Alberto referred to as action plans, and what we focus very much on, which is transition planning as a key tool, I would say, to really bring the science and the net zero pledges together and understand what it is that we want to measure, what it is that we are focusing on in the transformation, or let's say the transition journey of an entity, or it could be broader, a sector, etc. Just for clarification, by transition planning, I'm referring to how a company or an actor will reach the climate neutrality, or let's say net zero, in line with their own jurisdictional climate targets or the Paris aligned scenario that Bill was mentioning earlier in his presentation. And this is really important because, coming back to the EU context, there are currently actually financial regulatory initiatives in place that emphasize transition planning as an essential means to really increase the transparency and let's say the measurability of entities' decarbonization trajectories, and also to really incentivize investment in the transition. And this is something that many have spoken to already, but I think the financing aspect is really key here. And in the European Union, companies will be required to disclose climate transition plans under the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So this is part of an emerging and soon to be in place regulatory framework. And several other EU initiatives are also looking at developing requirements for transition plans disclosures. But the challenge here really is the scope and the level of details of these plans are vary significantly across EU initiatives. So the goal is to define the right standards and the granularity to be able to really measure and understand how these transformations are taking place. So we really need to see a sufficient level of ambition in these transition plans, and they need to be detailed and tie in with the science. And here I think we need to really articulate a set of principles of what these would be in the best case scenario. And that hasn't really taken place yet in the EU. And I know that this is a part of the recommendations that the HLEC group has issued, and it really chimes very much with what at E3G we see as the, let's say, ambitious principles for transition plans. And I'd like to just briefly articulate the 4 elements of this, which really nicely complements what Alberto and Bill have already said. So the first is that the transition plans align with economy-wide transition to net zero and climate neutrality. So with clear targets, emissions trajectories, and plans compatible with 1.5 degrees or a no overshoot scenario by 2050. We see also that there needs to be a commitment and action-oriented planning that sets out short, medium, and long-term actions that are dynamic with interim milestones that can be used to assess progress. So this comes to your question on how do we measure and understand all of this? And that will also explain how these actions are in line with the transition to climate neutrality. We also see that they should include progress monitoring through the adoption of quantifiable and time-bound key performance indicators. And I think this is really critical here. And they need to be accompanied by robust governance mechanisms with actually very relevant incentives and reporting and accounting structures. And they should also finally, to a point raised earlier, rely minimally on carbon offsets, which should really only be used to compensate emissions that are nearly impossible to abate. So I'll stop here and back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And more questions are coming in. I will bring them in a moment. But I would like to pick up on the point, Jurei, that you just made about, linking it back to the science, teeing it up with the science. I like the way you describe this. And Bill, how do we ensure globally a common baseline, a common scientific understanding? I know there are different approaches to this, but how do we, ultimately, given this is a UN-driven high-level expert group, how do we ensure consistency in how we look at the science?
Look, it's a really interesting question, and I think it also relates a bit to the point that question that Bartek has raised actually in the chat. Firstly, we have the IPCC that gives us a baseline on the science. It's almost universally adopted, the IPCC summary for policymakers and assessments. And as we know, that's fed into the international negotiations for the Paris Agreement. The recently concluded COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, sort of reinforced, did not go further, but reinforced the Glasgow agreements on the significance of 1.5 degrees. So in this way, I think we have a kind of a soft global benchmark established on the 1.5 degrees pathway. Now, of course, the 1.5 degree pathway is something that needs to be developed for each country within that framework. And as Bartek has pointed out, this is something that is principally on the heads of state actors. And we know that within the Paris Agreement context, that means there has to be a fair share arrangement. Developed countries go faster, developing countries a bit slower, and developed countries provide climate finance. The big critical issue is how does this translate into benchmarks for corporates, right? And that was a very big discussion in the high-level expert group because corporates are all over the world, some bigger and some larger. I think there's a strong distinction we drew between smaller corporate entities in developing countries and large global ones. And it's somehow clear that the large global corporates cover most of the emissions that we're talking about in the corporate area anyway, have common technological bases around the world. So there may not be a big difference between the level of action needed in a big corporate, I won't name any, in country X in the developing world versus country Y in the developed world. So that's something that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And the way that we approached that was through the other recommendations with other authors are going to talk about, in particular, the pathway to regulating this. The UN isn't going to regulate from the top down, it can't. So the challenge is for individual countries to pick up that regulatory burden and ultimately for the UN to oversee that. In terms of the critical question that Bartek raised about how this is to be reported, we have confidence in it. Two dimensions to the output from the high-level expert group report that the Secretary General picked up was, firstly, reporting will be focused, corporate reporting will in the end be focused through the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention portal, not straight away, but over time. It's very labor-intensive, expensive process of getting this, but this should then become available to all. And then the second track, which I know Helena's going to cover later, is the pathway to regulation. And this should bind it all together in a way that will give us confidence that non-state actors, corporates, are putting forward a decent fair share given their economic and technical starting points in individual countries, and should not allow for one corporate to play itself off against another operation in a developing country with a lower level of standards. I think that was also a big concern.
It's interesting you say this, and because lots of questions are coming in now. We're trying to keep up with them a little bit. But if I were to group a few of them together, it's two elements, and I pass to you first, Bill, and then to Alberto, is how stable are the current scenarios? We've got the 1.5, but then there was a discussion whether 1.5 is actually sustainable, whether we have to go up a few further elements to 1.8 degrees or something like that, because if you do transition plans, or we take a more ambitious target that's even lower, but how stable are these targets? Because otherwise the transition plans have to move with these moving targets. And the second question is, what role can we play at the international level in not just setting the targets, but giving more guidance in the transition planning? Because you're right, there's specificities and uniquenesses to each economy, developing versus developed economies, but still, otherwise there's a lot of room for interpretation and approach, and therefore comparability, reliability at the global level becomes more difficult. I hope I've kind of paraphrased nicely questions from Pier Francesco and Alex. Maybe Bill first and then Alberto.
Okay, a quick reaction. They're quite complex questions. For the questions from Alex, I think we should expect a tightening of emission pathways. One example is, to reach a temperature target means that the best available science is going to be updating the pathways over time. You can take the IPCC as a benchmark, expect that again in a few years. And entities like the International Energy Agency are updating theirs. If you look at the net zero roadmap, which was updated just recently by the International Energy Agency, take one example, gas, for example, total gas use globally is estimated in the update to have to decline substantially faster than in the 2021 report, right? And to reach lower levels earlier. So that's the kind of dynamics that I think anyone working in the climate policy space needs to be aware of, and corporates need to be aware of that as well. And there are ways of dealing with that uncertainty, but you should expect that. There could be other things that go wrong in the climate system. We're worried about feedbacks. If there is a large-scale feedback from the biosphere, then of carbon into the atmosphere, then it would lead to further tightening of the actual human emission reduction targets. That should also be on everyone's radar screen. It's come very strongly through the IPCC report. So, and actually it wouldn't lend itself to an argument about weakening the target, but accelerating efforts, because if those kind of effects occurred, it would be cause for major concern. Now, the second set of issues which relate to what Pier Francesco Rossi is asking is about some of the recommendations that are going to come later in this panel today, and they relate to the interlocking elements about accountability, verification, and so on. The high-level expert group recommendations are not going into a vacuum. There already is a rich ecosystem of entities doing parts of this job. SBTi is one part of it, GFANS is another, and there are plenty of others doing it. So the idea behind the recommendations is to provide high-level guidance to how these entities can do their work so that they are credible, verifiable, open to third parties to check and so on, to make sure that you do bring in the elements that you're talking about and provide that kind of guidance. So that means, to boil it down, if a corporate comes along and says, look, I'm producing widget X and I want to know how to get my widgets down to zero emissions and so on, you will find that not all sectors have to make the same emission reduction. Cement will be slower than electricity. We know that. So that the target setting entities or those providing guidance like SBTi need to take into account those dynamics in setting targets that are appropriate, that corporates can actually reasonably achieve, but that are aligned with 1.5 degree targets appropriate to their individual sectors or their overall value chain. And that's something which is essentially on the heads of all of the ecosystem of organizations working this forward.
Thank you very much, Bill. Maybe I can pass over to Alberto as well, because actually one of the questions I had was how do we continue to make sure that the transition plans align with new information, scientific information as it emerges. And I think it fits nicely into the questions that have come in. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think there is, and building on what Bill mentioned already, I mean, the science ultimately reflects the pace of decarbonization that the global economy, but also in individual sectors need to go through. And I think it's clear that the limit that we must avoid exceeding is 1.5 degrees. I don't think that will change. I think what will change is the pace of decarbonization depending on whether the world is actually reducing emissions or not, right? And I think if we translate these to individual entities, and that's where it's important to have robust target setting methods, is there are entities that have already started the decarbonization journey and that may be already on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and there are entities that haven't started the journey yet, right? That may be still increasing their emissions, or maybe they have stabilized emissions. And for those, basically, that means that they will have to accelerate the decarbonization pathway. They may have to decarbonize faster so that they don't exceed the carbon budget that is basically at the carbon budget that we have. So I think more than whether this would change the rate of decarbonization for individual entities, I think for those entities that already started, they need to continue to focus on getting to net zero by 2050, halving emissions by 2030. And for those that haven't started, the delay that this implies means that they will have to decarbonize even faster. And that's how I see the implications of delay or not delay, and how this could be presented eventually in emission pathways that are consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees.
But I think what both of you have raised is an interesting question, which is actually how to make the science practical. So we understand there will be new information available, things will evolve over time, but the key question for me really is, how do we guide companies? Because you just said, Alberto, certain companies will have to decarbonize quicker than others, or can decarbonize quicker than others. And you've got a little bit of a beggar your neighbor approach. You see what the other sector is doing before you do it. And I think that brings me to a nice question that Arthur Blancpain just asked, and maybe to you, Jurei. How do we, what role does, let's say, public policy play, and what role can the EU institutions play in, helping industry, guiding industry where emissions can be reduced quicker, where the transition plans can be maybe more ambitious, where they have to be maybe phased in a bit more slowly, or take cement. You just mentioned cement, Alberto, where we maybe need a bit more cement in the medium term, short term, to actually build the transition, new refineries, new approaches, new infrastructures. How do we steer that? I don't know. Maybe you've got some thoughts about that, Jurei, on the role of public policy in guiding the industry, the user community in their transition planning?
Thanks a lot. I think that's a really interesting question, kind of looking at how we bring the science and the evidence into the policymaking process for the transition. And I'd like to pick up on a lot of what was actually just said to come back to the point around needing guidance, right? I think in the EU context, we would really benefit from having a set of decarbonization pathways to really clarify what a credible transition aligned with 1.5 degrees target would look like for different sectors in the EU economy, and complementing the various voluntary and bottom-up approaches that already exist from the private sector and elsewhere. And it's not just about having a central set of guidance, it's really that I think that the quality of transition planning that I referred to earlier can really be improved by having this kind of guiding decarbonization pathways in an open source format, so that entities, regional administrations, also national governments can advance their own approaches towards achieving climate neutrality, net zero, and conduct proper benchmarking exercises. And I think in the EU context in particular, this is really important given the size of the market. And having this kind of sectoral plan certainly would help spur investments and reduce uncertainty, which I mentioned earlier, for the bigger market and the production networks. But coming back to this point on how do we bring that into the policy process, I think in the EU, the European Commission has a mandate under the climate law to engage with different sectors of the economy, to prepare indicative voluntary roadmaps to achieve climate neutrality. And there has been some progress made for certain sectors. I think tourism is one of those. But we really need to make sure that the science is there and it's backed by scientific evidence in these pathways for these 1.5 degree scenarios. So I see the need to kind of align the governance arrangements and the development and the guidance behind these kinds of pathways in a very robust way. And I see a potential role here in the EU for the new EU Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which was just established this year based on a mandate in the European climate law to really play this kind of role of safeguarding the scientific integrity of these pathways. And this body is intended to provide independent advice to EU decision makers. So I see this kind of function bridging the science and let's say the policy to really reflect and provide the guidance necessary for companies, for entities, and also more broadly.
Thank you very much. I think you raise an interesting point, which is kind of stakeholder engagement. And Bill, I want to come back to you on that. Also, what's your views on the regular annual reports on the scientific data and so on, and the trends that we see, but how do we link this back to the understanding for individual users, individual corporates in designing and updating their transition plans, be it on a 5-year regular basis or in a disclosure regime on an annual basis?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it builds on very strongly what Jurei was just saying, actually. Why? Because in order for stakeholders to understand and have input into, critique, and further enhance what corporates are doing, if I focus on corporates, they need to have really good benchmarks and really good data. And right now that doesn't exist. Some data is hidden behind paywalls, and there's often not transparency about what corporates are putting forward, and the benchmarks themselves are not necessarily widely accepted. So actually the model that Jurei talked about, where the European Union institutions, including the scientific body set up, is set to look at scientifically valid, strongly based benchmarks for individual industry sectors, is the way in which I imagine the high-level expert group recommendations being operationalized. There was a recognition that there's no UN body that can do this for different reasons. UNFCCC might not be in a position to do it. So I think that kind of infrastructure, credible baselines, credible sectoral pathways, mandatory reporting and disclosure of information, then provides the basis for empowering stakeholders, be they non-governmental organizations or the finance sector or investors or other companies simply trying to find out what others are doing, is so fundamental. And I think without that, this will remain a very contested space, a very fraught space. And we heard a lot of inputs from companies, some of whom didn't like this, but on the other hand, there were others that did. And in the end, it provides a level playing field for the corporate sector as well. It empowers and enables those who are trying to do the right thing to monetize better what they're doing, to sell better their pathway to net zero. If it's fully credible and valid, it should ultimately give them a better place in the market built on this credibility. So I think it's, yeah, the answer to your question about transparency and stakeholders is a bit complicated, but it's going to be built very much from the bottom up by what individual jurisdictions such as the EU do. And I think the EU is going to be one of the more fundamental actors in this space, as it is in others as well, with global overflow implications, I think.
I think, I find this interesting because there's kind of the engagement based on information flows, like what you said just now, Jurei, APIs, making information available. There's certain benchmarks, guidance, but I agree with you, Billy, it is quite a fragmented approach as to the different types of benchmarks that are available and how they're interpreted and the weight that they're given to, and every individual stakeholder will try and seek a benchmark that will put that stakeholder into the most favorable light available. So there's a bit of forum shopping going on. Europe is going a step further at the moment, as also Paul Tang said, in establishing standardized legislation. And Pier Francesco asked about the role of the corporate due diligence proposal. Maybe, Jurei, you could kind of respond to that, the importance or not of Europe creating harmonized regulatory frameworks as to the company's responsibility and approach towards transitioning.
Yeah, sure. I think it goes to what Bill was saying also about creating a level playing field, really. And in this sense, I also want to come back to the question that Pier Francesco was asking around what's available to provide this guidance for European institutions to provide more of a building block on transition plans specifically, because transition plans are articulating in the European, or let's say elements of what could go into them are articulated in the European sustainability reporting standards that will be used under the CSRD and also the due diligence directive. But here there are international initiatives that are going a step further, I would say. And one that I have in mind in particular is the UK government's Transition Plan Task Force, which was launched recently and has produced and launched at COP27 a set of templates for what best in class, let's say, transition plans could look like. And I think these initiatives we can really learn from in the EU, but also the EU could emulate in trying to set out much more clear guidance on what would be credible a transition plan for corporates, for different entities. And this goes to the point I made earlier around having some principles that are agreed as a kind of vision and a signpost across EU legislative initiatives, which are, let's say, fragmented, or at least the different initiatives are currently talking about transition and transition planning in different ways, so we can have that coherence emerge from these different pieces. So I would say that kind of clarity would also improve the understanding and really the adoption of transition plans by corporates and really minimize the uncertainty.
Thank you. And by the way, it's good that you mentioned the UK initiative. We've later got Sasha Zadan with us, who's the lead in sustainability in the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and who's a member of that group and who will speak to this. But I think it's a really interesting example of providing guidance. And I don't know, Alberto, whether you kind of want to reflect further on the role of public authorities or other parties in providing guidance as to how companies and non-state actors should organize their transition planning.
Well, I think, I mean, in my view, we need clear standards, as Jurei mentioned earlier, and I would say we need standards across different dimensions. The first one is standards on how companies account for emissions. And of course, right now, the most common standard is the greenhouse gas protocol. Then the second key standard that we need is how companies set targets. And I would say that this is where we're focused on in the SBTi. and making sure that these targets are robust and consistent with the latest science. Then the third piece is how companies set transition plans, and this is what Jurei mentioned and what the UK Transition Planning Task Force is bringing. And then the last piece is disclosure standards, right? Which is basically what we are seeing now emerging both in regulatory and non-regulatory efforts through ISSB, the standards produced by IFRAC, and some of the proposal from the SEC in the US, and we have equivalent in other geographies. And I think all of those need to be aligned. They need to be, sending the same signal, providing the same incentive to minimize the fragmentation that exists today, and to make it as simple as possible for stakeholders to assess how non-state actors, companies, and financial institutions embark on this decarbonization journey.
Thank you very much indeed. Maybe to close us out, I want to just cover one last theme, which is kind of the let's say, tension between incentives and mandatory obligations when it comes to transition planning. And I would like to maybe come back to you, Bill, how do you see basically the engagement with stakeholders to make clear to them that, yes, we need to do this because, as you set out at the beginning of this discussion, that there's a clear scientific and environmental imperative. But ultimately, human beings are also looking at interests, how to kind of align their own interests with that transition. And I'd be interested in your views of that, but also of your views of that, because obviously, we know there's a climate emergency, but ultimately individuals are driven not only by that, something that seems, it's not that far off, but in the daily lives it still seems fairly far off, 2030 and 2050. How do we align it more with individuals' interests? Maybe Billy first.
It's a good question. I mean, it goes back to one of the points that one of the people who asked questions was about, that at the end of the day, implementing the Paris Agreement is a state responsibility. So nation states need to be regulating their own sectors and corporates. For that reason, the high-level expert group did not recommend that all corporates take on legally binding targets. So we recognize that right now there's a voluntary movement in that area. Some jurisdictions may wish, and it might be a good thing, to require that corporates have targets. But we wanted to try and build on the positive momentum that you're referring to, where it's a good thing that a lot of companies want to set net zero targets. It's not a great thing that a lot of them are tantamount to greenwashing. So we wanted to provide, with these recommendations, the philosophical framing was to try and provide a way of providing incentives for doing it right. In other words, to level that playing field that Jurei was talking about earlier. And if we can do that, then we think that should provide the incentives for companies to do the right thing. They'll be able to convince their investors, corporate regulators, their broader stakeholders, the ESG communities, that we, company Y, are doing the right thing and should be rewarded by being able to sell our products differentially against those that aren't. So I think that's the way in which I would see the incentive system operationalizing in a way. And I think that's a really important framing, but each country will need to look at its own regulatory context and actually move corporates forward in their own way.
I think that's a really nice segue into some of the later sessions, Billy, but I'd just be interested, Jurei, as I said, in your thoughts on this as well.
Thanks. It is a very interesting question, and actually my comments will complement Bill's very much in that I think it's about understanding what the benefits are. In a lot of our conversations that we've been having with partners, with stakeholders, including in different parts of Europe, such as Central and Eastern Europe, what we found is that by and large, while there's support for the ultimate, let's say, outcomes or the goals of EU Green Deal policies, if it's framed just from a climate science urgency perspective, it doesn't resonate that much with different segments of the population, at least in these parts of the EU, broadly speaking, of course. So really, I think it's about being aware that we need to build a political support context for the uptake of these initiatives, be it transition planning at the entity level, the political context for more, let's say, national, other regulatory initiatives. And to do that, we need to move, I think, and complement the science with the emotional bit a little bit. And it's not urgency, it's actually what is in it for me. And it is, what is the societal benefit? What is the benefit for the businesses? And what are the risks of not undertaking an orderly transition? And I think it's by building this kind of political narrative that we can, and in an inclusive way with different stakeholders through engagement mechanisms that I agree with Bill would fall on perhaps the Commission in this case in the EU or national authorities to actually organize and undertake to really develop these stories and test them out with the stakeholders. They would have to really recognize the upsides as well as the kind of risks of not doing this properly. And I would emphasize maybe 3 arguments for the transition in the EU context, which would be the benefits of this are reducing the risks of a disorderly transition, right? So that's one that is not maybe as well understood as it could be. Having a transition plan, to go back to that theme, can really help facilitate matchmaking for investors because it can provide and show where investments would be needed, what kind of technologies are being identified, et cetera. So this can really help a kind of more forecasting purpose and be a really useful tool for that. And I don't think this has been communicated well enough either. And it can really offer kind of to that theme, again, an indication of market development. So this can be really useful beyond just the goals of meeting our climate targets. This can bring real benefits to businesses and also to economies trying to also remain competitive. So I think we need to really put it in this context as well and have the engagement mechanisms to disseminate these kinds of stories to build the political capital to undertake these massive transformations.
In fact, I would go a step further. Maybe I can even add one additional one, Jurei, and that is, I think any good transition planning is not only a proxy, but a clear expression of very good risk management. And I think and good governance in companies and for stakeholders. So if you see that, you should normally feel comfortable that in other areas of risk planning, particular stakeholders also very well suited, and that should give investors and the overall society community in which those actors operate more comfort. I think I would like to thank you all for a very, very interesting panel, setting the scene, part of setting the scene for this report, and the importance of science and how we build the continuous evolution of scientific information into the transition planning process. Thank you very much indeed to you, Jurei, to Alberto and to Bill for being with us.